All right. I hope YouTube doesn't pull that video down just for that little bit. So I thought I'd start off with a little bit of music, and that was actually Jacqueline Dupree playing the Dvorak Cello Concerto with the London Symphony Orchestra. And the reason I played it was something that I've always been fascinated with. Kind of two things. One, memory, or musicians' ability to memorize music, and sight reading. So we'll talk about the memory aspect first. Should you play from memory? Why are some people so good at playing extended play? I'm talking really written music. I'm not talking about improvising. I'm talking piece that's been written out. So in the case of that Dvorak piece, that's a piece that's like close to an hour. I think it's about 45 minutes to 15 minutes long, depending upon who's playing it. And so I've always been fascinated, or I've become more fascinated with it since I started playing the cello with soloists in the classical genre. Really, the question I ask myself is why are soloists playing with no music in front of them? So you can see concertos and very lengthy, very complicated pieces, and everybody in the orchestra is reading off of a chart. The conductor is reading the music, but yet the soloist is playing these long passages, these complicated pieces of music, and they're doing this stuff from memory, like Jacqueline Dupree did, like Yo-Yo Ma does, like all these people, on their instruments as soloists. So I was curious to know, how did this start? And really, what's the history of it, specifically with classical, and kind of talk. I want to talk a little bit about classical and obviously jazz and non-classical, and then later on, I want to talk a little bit more about sight reading, because the two are not in opposite with each other. So, did a little bit of research on the classical side, and turns out. And I'm not saying this is the way it is, so you can't believe everything you read. Apparently, Clara Schumann, who was married to Robert Schumann, she was a child prodigy and was trained as a classical pianist. And she was a prodigy, as I said before, was very, very good. And that at some point around the 1850s, oh God, I guess Schumann was committed, and they had about like 9 kids. So she had to figure out a way to make a living. So she wanted to go back and start concertizing. And so she thought, supposedly, I wouldn't say it's a gimmick, but it was something that would enhance the ability of more people coming in to see her play, to be able to play from memory and not be looking at the sheet of music, which was common at that time. So she started performing from memory. She started performing the pieces, and over a period of time, this sort of became the norm. So if you see classical players, soloists in particular, playing concertos or pieces of music, they typically do not have any music in front of them. And so it's a skill set. It's a skill set some people have, and it's a skill set some people do not have. And I would probably argue that there are some phenomenal players out there who could concertize, but do not concertize out of the fear that they don't want to be looking at the music, because that is just not the norm within that tradition. At least that's been my perception. So I was curious why the other members of the orchestra didn't play the same way, because there are some benefits to memorizing music. I think the most obvious is really enhancing the music itself, or you can think about musicality. If you have mastered the music and you've sort of memorized it, you can focus more on musicality, you can focus more on technique, you can focus more on interpretation. You're not honed to the stuff that's right in front of you. So you're not thinking about the next note, the meter, or anything like that. You've moved beyond that. Now it's supposed to be your soul pouring out, supposedly. I would argue that the people who are reading music, because I know some really excellent musicians who read music out there, and they can interpret and they can do interpretation while they're reading. I would argue that that's not necessarily always the case, but that's the norm. And if you kind of think about it, if you look at Stevie Wonder, and it's not classical, but if you look at a lot of blind people, their other senses are enhanced. So if you can't see, it feels like your hearing is enhanced more. If you close your eyes and you don't look at something and you're playing, I do this all the time sometimes in my playing. I find I can pull something extra out when I don't have to look at the music or even look at the instrument. I'm in another world when I'm doing that, so I'm vibing from that perspective. But the other members of the orchestra are talented instrumentalists as well. So why aren't they reading? Why are they reading the music? There are three reasons typically why that might happen. Why they're reading the music versus not memorizing it per se. I think the first one is lack of time. In a lot of orchestras, because they're performing a lot of other people's music, and that gets to the second element, which is the breadth of music. So soloists tend to focus for the most part, even though they might have a wide variety of solos that they do. They might be Bach specialists, Dvorak, Chopin specialists, and so they know that piece of music really well. Orchestras are required to have breadth of music, and sometimes they have lack of time because hey, next month this is happening, this is that happening, so they really don't have the time to sort of memorize that and the breadth. The third thing is the need for consistency. I think this is important. When you play a solo, even if it's not improvisation, you have some freedom to play something a little bit different. I wouldn't say improvise per se within the classical genre. I'd say just play it differently. And when you're talking about groups of musicians, they have to be consistent. So everybody in the horn section has to play it pretty much the same way. So you better read that piece of music. There's not room for, hey, I want to slur this note, but the music doesn't call for that. I want to hammer on glissendos, forte, diminuendo, all that stuff. You have to be consistent. Okay, so there's not that room for lack of consistency. Whereas with a soloist, you do have the opportunity to express yourself a little bit more. And for lack of a better word, you probably can be inconsistent. One night you can slow it down, you can speed it up. You can slur a little bit more than you do. You can't really be doing that. So those three reasons primarily: lack of time, breadth of the works, and just the need for consistency are the reasons primarily why orchestras tend to read music. That's been what I started seeing. So let's talk about sight reading. Okay, so that is an art, and it's not mutually exclusive to memory or memorizing long passages of music. And I said to myself, well, why aren't guitar players better sight readers? Everybody knows part of it is the complexity of the guitar. You've got notes appearing like 50 different places, six strings, all of that stuff that complicates it. Much easier for me to read or sight read off of a cello than it is off of a guitar. I know where the notes are. Once I learn the time signature, it's more about the technique. So it's a lot easier than guitar. The other thing too, guitar has a couple of different functions. It's a solo instrument, but it's also an accompanying instrument. So you're required to learn chords. So chordal formation is much more is as important. Sometimes you can make your living as a jazz player just how you can accompany people, not so much how you can solo. So that makes it much more difficult. And I would argue it's the way we begin the process of learning the guitar. Most people learn guitar as a folk instrument. So and when I say folk, I don't just mean like the 60s or anything like that. It could be learning, the Beatles. It's really pop instrument. That's probably a more appropriate word. So they learn it at that level. And so there's not a pedagogy for it that's structured in the same way you're learning the keyboard, you're learning the violin, you're learning the cello. So that has a history of teaching you how to read music. So typically speaking, most guitarists come about it after they've sort of been playing for several years. Then they buy a Mel Bay book, or they decide to get a teacher that teaches them how to read. And so that makes it much more difficult. It no longer becomes like breathing. Whereas if you're 5 years old, you start playing the keyboard and you're reading treble and bass clef, that's very natural. Same goes if you're starting to learn the cello and they tell you this is an A note and you get it properly trained. So anyway, though, so both skill sets, the ability to play from memory and the ability to sight read, will ultimately make you a better musician. They are not mutually exclusive, and being good at one and not so good at the other, or vice versa, or not good at both of them, does not mean that you are not a great musician. There are tons and tons of great musicians who are not able to do either of those two. All right, then. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe. Bye now.